Hello, everybody, and welcome to another conversation in our series on seeking harmony. This week, we are looking at a few topics that we believe are quite related to the
Sorry, you guys. Is
Sorry.
it difficulty? I'm gonna come back.
I think Grandma might still be having trouble with his internet, maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there he is.
Okay, there he is.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Hello.
fun times. Something just cut out.
Yeah. Don't forget to record.
Okay, yeah, sorry. As I was saying to everybody, welcome to our conversation. We believe that the conversation today and the topics are very profoundly related to a choice between love and illusion. And what is happening in the world right now is that we're seeing almost potentially components of history potentially repeating itself. And so I feel like our conversation is just going to allow us to really focus on what that choice is. And in that choice, what do we believe the potential outcome or even potential consequences of those various choices might entail? So I will open it up to the team and we will allow the conversation to flow freely. So I'd like to find out from the team which topic they believe is and was top of mind for them.
I feel like the story around Mao Zedong and China was probably the most telling about the pattern that we're going to discuss today. So do you guys feel good about like starting with that?
Yeah.
So I do remember like studying in my studies of like history and geopolitics, but historians are very like say that memories are important. They help us understand the history. They help us have like all the different sides of history. And they also help in a very like human and ethical way to not repeat history. And the problem with a lot of countries that aren't choosing love is that they tend to delete the memories of everyone, to like rewrite the narratives that they want to have for their countries, because it's more about like visibility and communication and reputation instead of actual history and actually claiming history and just like doing with the truth of what happened and their choices. And the problem with that is that in denying their people the truth of the choices, like we're going to come back to a cycle of doing the same patterns. And, you know, for China, the story wasn't that old, because the woman that was sharing it through a book is still alive. And we know that for a country, in terms of karma and pattern, it's not like so easy to overcome them. So it may take years and decades and sometimes centuries. And so, yeah, the fact that Chinese authorities are claiming that what she experienced on the Mao was not true, I think is very hurtful, because like it's a denying of the truth and it's a denying of love. And so in short, it's a denying of oneself. And spiritually it's like very not good. And also, yeah, historically it's not gonna, maybe it's gonna, you know, make the cycle repeat like she is fearing. And so, yeah, I wonder if you guys want to go deeper into what she was communicating about what she lived on the Mao and what she is living now, and how you feel about that.
Yeah, I felt that, well, you're right that a lot of countries, and China in particular, wants to sanitize its history. And you know, it's all about the issue is that they were trying to they didn't say this explicitly, of course, because it was a communist state that was atheist, but they were trying to deify Mao. And so so when he's like at that god status or demigod, which by the way is just a continuation of like the empire, right, that came before it, the Chinese imperial family. So it's no different essentially in that way. But so that's the issue that they're having. I think partly, so in a way they never separated church and state, because when the state becomes the church, you still have a problem with separating church and state. So I feel like that's how it was. And I understand that it's challenging because even in a democratic country, like the US is a great example. Like even in a democratic country, like we are still argue about our history, and we still debate like very basic things in our history. And people have disputed so many things, like about, you know, slavery is a huge example, or like the Civil War, like what the Civil War was about, you know. So it makes sense. And then if you add on top of it like a government where like technically you're not allowed to disagree with the government's narrative, like you've got a recipe for like, yeah, a lot of like lack of reflection there historically. But yeah, I see that
Yeah,
as like similar.
you can't erase the people, you know, and the voice of the people, and like Irene was saying, like the memories and everything. You can't. It's always there.
Yeah.
And I don't know what, I mean, I found it really interesting that the pattern seems to be repeating very clearly, like in China, that this whole sort of just, you know, denying the truth, denying what happened in the past. And, you know, it's, and like, as Sage pointed out, like it happens in a lot of countries, and even countries that, you know, on the surface are democratic, and there's, you know, in theory, like room for all viewpoints and ideas, but then you still see instances where people just cannot accept what happened, even if like there's very clear facts, data, like just some people will never, you know, accept it. And like you said, slavery really is one big good example that, you know, a lot of Americans, they're so offended when you even talk about it, but it's something that, you know, happened, and we're still feeling the effects. And so I feel like that's where the pain comes in from, especially if we're like go back to China, to that woman, I forgot her name, but the author specifically that, you know, wrote these memoirs under Mao, but then like felt like she had to burn them because it could potentially put her in danger and her family in danger. And then, you know, she's like in her 90s now and questioning her own memory, and, you know, or other people question her memories, like, did it really happen that way? And I feel like it makes it impossible for a country to heal itself and to like reconcile those karmic patterns, because you have to like fully be aware of the problem and kind of what happened before you can heal it. And, you know, it's it makes sense that it's kind of a pattern everywhere, because it's obviously in like the human consciousness. And for some reason, there's a part of our consciousness that does not want to look at painful things and things that, you know, it takes a sort of like self-responsibility and just admitting that, you know, that was not a good choice. But it's okay, because as we learn in TFAS, you know, pain, fear, all those things are really an illusion, and you're able to like move beyond it. So I feel like that's where, like, Yoreen, you were asking like where her pain is. I feel like it might be related to, you know, maybe it's not allowing her own healing either, you know, by feeling like her birth country doesn't accept what happened to her firsthand.
So I think you guys have touched on something very important at the core of this choice. And for me, it's the concept of acceptance that you were speaking to, Andrea, that there is a level of acceptance required, or an acknowledgement required, in order for the healing to even just begin. And so so as you say, that almost the deeply rooted pain is kind of glossed over because the acceptance and the acknowledgement isn't there. There's an absolute call for healing, but without the acceptance of the thing that exists, it's literally the way we would look at our healing through the mirror exercise. If we deny the upset, or that the upset exists, we can't heal it. And that denial possibly bypasses something spiritually, because acceptance allows us to look into that space and to accept responsibility for having created in our reality, and for allowing us to transcend the pain of that creation in our reality by bringing love there. So there's a big component of spiritual bypassing at a almost national consciousness level when you think about something like what is happening now under Jinping's presidency in relation to, and in similarity to, Mao Zedong's running of the country at whichever point in history. And also the denial of somebody's real experience of it by questioning the validity of her sanity and the validity of her memories, to me, is almost national gaslighting. So there's a kind of very messy pot of stew being cooked with probably rotten vegetables. If you wanna just put it in a context that just makes it, that just shows, just tells what it is. It's literally a rotten stew with foul vegetables, and people are being expected to consume this. And as opposed to anything healthy, it's probably gonna poison their national consciousness even more.
Yes, I wanted to touch on the denial part, because I spent some time in Beijing with the university students there doing research, and I was just a curious student. I didn't really recognize the policies or like the conservativeness that they instilled on everyone. So when I asked about the genocide or what's going on in the country to the students, just like, how do they feel? Because I feel like if something was going on like that in America, we would know about it. We would be able to speak about it at least. And they were just in complete denial and not even knowing what I was talking about. And I went to a particular place, Old Beijing, where it was concentrated with Muslim Chinese people. And even the street vendors, everyone didn't know what I was talking about when I asked them, like, what's going on in the recent news, and have you guys heard about this? How do you feel about this? Of course, after a while of asking and being around the students, my university students were like saying, don't ask these questions. People might get uncomfortable, and yeah, you might not be in the best eye with the university if you continue asking these questions. So yeah.
I feel like though, even in, countries like, once again, in the States, even though there's room to talk about it, and you find more of a mix of viewpoints, I feel like the depth, there's always like a place where you reach where like most people don't really want to look at it. It's almost like, well, that was a problem back then, but we've gotten a lot better. And yes, like, society has progressed, but I mean, you still can't deny that racism is a huge issue in the United States. And like, especially when we look at like some police interactions, like the disproportionate number of racial minorities that are incarcerated, like who live in poverty, like there's all these social markers that still indicate that there might be a problem that may stem from the time that people were enslaved in this country. African Americans were enslaved, but yet like the number of people that are like willing to go there and make that connection is very few, and the ones that do, they're kind of seen as like rebels or renegades, or like that they're saying something like really crazy, like they're just a crazy liberal or something like that. But there's like a spiritual truth to it that cannot be denied, and yet it is very much denied in a country that touts itself to be like very open-minded and progressive.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that same university, when I brought up the disproportion of prisoners in our criminal system, called it fake news. So to be under that same university in China asking these questions, as well as like receiving that same discrimination in my own country, like I went that far as to be able to write about it, but then it was completely disregarded. But I didn't even go as that far to talk about it. It was completely shunned, and like they were like, what are you talking about?
It's not fake news. The Bureau of Justice Statistics collects this data. So even the government agrees, but even yet, like, you show people numbers and it's the same thing, like, oh no, there's no way that's true. But yes, there is a way that this is true.
I think there's definitely a certain, plateau under which like nobody wants to go, like in most of the world. And it often has to do with things that have been sensitive for all of consciousness, which is like race, acknowledgement of racism, or even colonization, like some people going as far in Europe as to say that colonization had some like positive effects, or LGBTQ rights, or even women rights, like saying that, oh, women didn't have equal rights before, but right now they do. So what do you want? Do you want to destroy us and have women take the lead and kill all men? Because like it's over. We do have equal rights now. Things like that you hear every day. So I feel like there is a certain level of denial that all of consciousness experiences, but these are more global, where sometimes there is something about a country that is very specific to its choices and karma. And basically, most countries have the same problems. So it tells you that even though it takes a different aspect, it's the same everywhere. And obviously, to certain degrees within countries that are more like democratic, and some that have different, political systems. But yeah, I do feel like there's something global about it. And to end on denial, I feel like before this work, for example, I was in denial of myself, because all the time, like, family and people in my close circle of like socialization would tell me who I was, and I wouldn't identify with it. But because I didn't have examples of people who really claimed themselves, I was in denial of myself. And I'm still healing that, and I feel how painful it is. So I must say how painful it must be for the people of China. And also, to begin with this work will feel like death for them, probably. And that may be why they feel uncomfortable, and why it's so difficult to talk about it, because it's so, like, unless they're gonna have a big crisis or upheaval, they're not going to go deep into that, because they will feel like they will lose everything, and have death. So it takes a certain spiritual willingness to look at all that. And I realize that now, and I feel that's why I have more compassion for people in general, even when they say crap, But yeah. And also, I feel that's why we have people like Martin Luther King, sometimes once every 5 years or once in a decade, will rise up to send a message that, hey, like, the work is not over, don't fall asleep. There is still work to do there. And I'm here to show that why there's still work to do there. And he was killed for his opinion and how he voiced things. So he definitely, by his life, and by the end of his life, he basically illustrated why there was still work to do there. And I feel like criminal injustice, like police injustice in the USA and everywhere else, will at least have that effect of saying to people, there's still work to do there, and there's still something to heal. And the people will not remember this as a peaceful, equal time, because they were not loved there. And so I think that's the message that I feel close to this Martin Luther King Day, and also close to the shooting of that person in what area of the United States? I don't remember.
Ironically enough, it was Atlanta, Georgia, which is where Martin Luther King.
Oh dear.
Was, yeah.
Okay.
And he was born there, I believe. He had his childhood home.
True. Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that is sadly synchronistic, but yeah, I do feel like there's still a lot to unpack here. And as I said earlier, healing a whole country and a whole consciousness takes decades and centuries. So we may look at it and see that it's just like a roundabout of a pattern that is, circling back to us to be healed, probably.
So I also have another perspective on this. And, we've spoken about the denial component, but also the fact that there are people that still choose to shine the spotlight on these topics and these discussions and that kind of thing also speaks to a choice to love, for the reason that love does not allow you to deny the truth. And love that wouldn't allow us to deny the truth, or allow us to allow our reality to deny what's at the core. And so, as you say, the people like Martin Luther King that would occasionally stand up and voice their opinion and die for the courage of their convictions, still speaks to a choice to love, because love points out what's also out of alignment. And so we mustn't lose sight of that component of what is happening here while we're still looking at the component of saying, well, the denial could very easily allow history to repeat itself. And then you also need to look at the component of love that's so strong that says, I'm gonna still say that I don't agree because I don't agree, because it's wrong, because it doesn't work, because it will lead us down a very uncomfortable, very unhealthy, possibly very dangerous path if we all sit in silence. Because at the end of the day, silence is consent. So you can't then turn around down the line and go, well, I did voice my opinion, or I was too afraid to voice my opinion. If you didn't voice your opinion, or you were too afraid to voice your opinion at any given time, in essence, you agreed to the prevailing narrative at the time. So we also need to look at that component of love being that powerful that sometimes it's one lone voice in a myriad that says, actually, no. This is not okay. This is not correct. That is not the truth.
Yeah, I think that that's so true, because no matter like how messy it is or how long it takes, that's why we see change, that because that voice of love is always there. It never really goes away. It can't be diminished. It can't be fully like snuffed out. No, even if people try to, or government tries to, yeah, that's why we see, even if it takes a century to get there, you eventually you do see that change. It always comes back to the side of love, always, because that's human nature. We go there. That's it. We always go toward there.
And I also feel like, especially going back to Martin Luther King and how his life was cut short tragically. I mean, we all know that these things are not random. Like, everything has a reason for it, that based in love, even if in that moment you cannot see that and understand it. And I feel like for him, whether he was conscious of it or not, like, obviously it seemed like he had a very specific soul mission once he came to this earth. And, he fulfilled it very well, because he's been so influential. Even though his body passed, I feel like he's like one of like an icon. Obviously, there's a national holiday here in the States, but like that energy that he put out, that love, it was almost like a catalyst to like pave the way for so many other people. And we talked about Barbara Walters doing the same last week, and so it really always goes back to love, even if on the surface there's tragedy and just a lot of conflict. Like, sometimes those things seem to be needed to really get the ball rolling in terms of making a change.
And I wanted to mention, if you guys notice where Martin Luther King Jr.'s highways are, or the street names that it is the areas that is the most least funded and most like least kept in like various states. I know in Delaware, the Martin Luther King exit is like not well upkept. In Florida, I saw not well upkept. So it's bringing that truth into our reality as well, as like, this is someone with such a strong soul purpose and brought such change, but yet it wasn't reflected in that way, sustainable.
Yeah, because I think that like there's a mixture of like people honoring him and people knowing his legacy, like Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy, and also people just like kind of whitewashing his legacy, to use a double entendre for that, you know. And yeah, I think that's one example too. Like I did notice that I've in the multiple cities I've been to in the US, the Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard usually, or Avenue or whatever, that's named after him, it's usually in a really rough area that's like really like not invested in it all, and all of this. And of course, like everyone who occupies those areas, like they're choosing this in some way, you know, because nobody is just a victim. Like obviously everyone creates their reality, but it is an interesting, it points to how they're in consciousness, like in the US, you see there's like this hypocrisy in a sense of like there's honoring Martin Luther King Jr., but then there's like honoring him. The government's strategy is said, I haven't verified this, but I read that Ronald Reagan said, like, he was like, we want to make Martin Luther King Jr. Day, like his birthday, a holiday, but we don't want to honor the actual Martin Luther King Jr. We want to honor this sanitized image of him, you know, who said like, well, you know, everybody, like we're all, I don't know how best to characterize that, you know, like the whitewash narrative of Martin Luther King Jr. Like, I don't know how to like describe it in a nutshell. It's kind of like a kumbaya kind of narrative. Yeah. It doesn't include the parts where he's saying like, you know, where he's like really sharply criticizing the US government, capitalism in America, or like white people. It leaves that out. It's the kumbaya, like we're all united, we're all one message. And, you know, if we just like, like sometimes the famous thing in America is like, when, you know, a Black person brings up some like uncomfortable truth about racism or history in America, then the response by like a white person who's offended, or whoever who's offended, is they bring up like hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that, like Martin Luther King's quote. And they're saying that like that person bringing up an uncomfortable truth is being hateful, like that it's hateful to bring up an uncomfortable truth.
It's infuriating.
And it's like, it's so dumb because you're using Martin Luther King's quote to like invalidate somebody's critique of racism.
The truth. Oh, yeah.
And but it's actually, it makes sense though, because he's a figure who he had that compassion and that understanding of our oneness and how love is the answer. But he also had sharp, trenchant critique of the ills of the country at the same time.
He spoke to the truth
so
that everyone was experiencing, and that's why so many people of color and, you know, people who were having that experience were like, yes, finally, like someone's saying what we've been feeling.
Yeah.
And like we can like stand with this person because I agree with this person, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, being sharp is part of love too, but I feel like most people don't recognize that because we have not been used to having really like sharp, direct honesty as being a form of loving communication. And yeah, of course, parts of the divine mission and purpose of Martin Luther King was being like this shining light and attracting people, bringing them hope. But it doesn't mean that he didn't have like discipline in him. I mean, wasn't he a pastor or something? I feel like you have to have some discipline in you to be a pastor. And I feel it's part of him too. And the fact that it's being denied speaks to that thing of countries about like going into progress, but choosing the sides that only you want to take. For example, it's like France is like the country of the human rights, because we were like allegedly the first to write a declaration of human rights. And also our constitution is about being one and undivided people, but it's like one and undivided up until they feel like it's the values of the old friends are being maybe shattered, and they feel endangered, or they feel like there is not enough white French people in France anymore. And so it's like pretty, what we were talking about with Anja a few weeks ago, it's pretty weird to be in that situation of being, oh, we're one and undivided and we're the country of human rights. Like, you can't accuse us of being hateful, because that's hateful, but at the same time denying parts of our truth and parts of our history and parts of who we are. And I feel a lot of countries have some healing to do about that too, because we've talked about it many times. It's in the US, it's in the shooting of people, it's in Argentina denying its colored past and slavery and indigenous people. It's in Brazil going to a far-right president and then coming back. It's everywhere. Like, you can't deny that there's something about that everywhere. And so there's something to heal everywhere about, like, yeah, you can't really like take the parts of the food that you want and leave the rest and say like, oh yeah, I understood everything, I ate everything, and no, you didn't. And I don't know if that imagery is very good, but that's how I feel about, it's like yeah, it's like you're hiding the food somewhere to rot, parts of the food, and then eating the rest. And it's just like, no, it doesn't work like that. Obviously it's gonna smell and everyone is gonna know that it smells, and then you're gonna keep denying that it smells, and you're gonna look pretty fucking stupid but it still smells.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask too, like, what did you guys think about the Martin Luther King Jr. quote that we were talking about? Like the one where he says, like in the US, we have socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. Because like later on in Martin Luther King Jr.'s career or life mission, he started to move into broader critiques about war and capitalism in America, how it was, and poverty. And that's when the government, it said, it really started to be like, oh my God, this guy's dangerous. Like, what did you guys think about that quote? Yeah.
Honestly, I feel like there's a lot of truth in it. Because my degree's in criminal justice and criminology. So I've spent a lot of time just researching and interacting with people that are, working in the system. And I feel like the criminal justice system really reflects like bigger cultural norms in any given society. And like the one thing that people always use to kind of justify this purely like punitive crime control model, like no thought to rehabilitation, is always this idea of individualism. Well, that person should have known better. And, you know, if this person can do well, then that person can do well. They just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And there's like this constant narrative like that. And, you know, it's not a coincidence that our criminal justice system marginalizes poor people. Like the vast majority of people who are incarcerated come from lower socioeconomic brackets, you know, people that have money to post bail, post bond, like they're not going to be spending much time incarcerated, and they're probably going to be able to hire a good lawyer, and they have like all these resources. And so it's like, and I like related to the MLK quotes, I feel like he's touching upon that sort of dichotomy, like, you know, abundance and getting support from the government is good, but it's only good and valid for a certain sector of the population. If you're on the other side of that and you're viewed as poor or, you know, whatever else, just different from like the mainstream white Anglo-Saxon sort of, you know, culture, which is like prevalent in the United States, you're and especially if you're poor, like it's a whole nother set of rules for you. Like you should just know better. You should just be able to get an education yourself and not really, you know, worry about it. You should be able to find a good job. But it's like society isn't structured in that way where it creates that equality. It's structured to create inequality. And it's like, as soon as you bring it up, oh, they should have known better. But you know, you won't hear that if it's like Bernie Madoff or someone else that has the resources. Yeah, so that's kind of what I feel like he was getting at in that quote. That's what brought to mind for me.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I think I feel like it speaks to a significant fueling of separation between those that have and those that don't. And the ones that don't, it's almost made to sound as if it's their fault that they don't. Forgetting that there's a very powerful system that has evolved over years that have, in one way or another, privileged the people that still continue to be privileged. And the fact is, it has become so entrenched in our way of life that the minute you speak to those two dichotomies, the people that have literally only find the attack in the conversation. And when you speak to those that do not, they literally only find the discrimination and unfairness in the narrative. There's never a point at which there's a meeting of minds that says we understand that literally, systemically, there is a boil that needs to be lost. You know, because literally that's what it is. The fact of the matter is there's a festering sore that needs to be treated. And it can't be treated by covering it with a plaster or a bandage or any other such thing that hides the problem. I feel like that's where the challenge sits. For as long as there's the hiding behavior, we're probably never going to truly find common ground. We might speak to it. We might even institutionally do things that try to pull us together. But again, it speaks to that very ingrained pain that is not actually being allowed to be healed because of the denial.
How do you guys feel this relates to the shooting of Daniel Gordon? Or how do you feel about it?
I think that it speaks to the trauma of discrimination in America, and how that the trauma was kind of activated. And I think that was obviously, so in, Daniel Gordon was shot by this guy who had dropped his car off at the tire shop, right, to be worked on. And I feel like it, and he, that Quandarius McDowell shot Daniel Gordon because Daniel Gordon was taking the car for a test drive, and Quandarius McDowell thought that he was stealing his car, which is like a crazy thing, but it speaks to this person had this like trauma. I feel like it's like a trauma reaction, which doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. It finds the reason, that saying like, oh my God, this person is like stealing my car, and reacts like all of a sudden, like without any second thought and violently, killing this person, like way overdoing anything that would be reasonable because of this trauma of being like, there's lack, and so people are out to steal and to take from me, and so I have to be on guard about that. So that's a trauma. And B, it could have even been like kind of paranoia. Yeah, it could be even and that's a big mental health issue if you are going to shoot somebody because you think that the person who repaired your car is going to steal your car. But yeah, and it could also speak to just like just prejudice in the US, like racial prejudice, because obviously like Daniel Gordon who was shot was a Black man, but Quandarius McDowell, who shot him, was also a Black man. But that doesn't rule out that there is this feeling of like there's still that, that guardedness and that discrimination. And I don't know what words I'm trying to find for this, but like, I don't know, it felt like that kind of mentality of like, oh my God, look at that person. That person's obviously guilty. That person's obviously doing something bad, just like a hair trigger like that. And the thing is, like, yeah, I feel like that plays out a lot in the US. And I think that's part of what Martin Luther King was talking about, how people's mentality, it's like the mentality that we're healing in the US is like when you look at a person, whether your reaction is like, I see this person's humanity and I have compassion for them and, everything, or I don't see it and I just condemn them. It's that kind of like judgment that pops up. That's what I got.
So I feel like you're talking to an almost endemic problem of racial profiling, and it doesn't have to play out in opposing races. It can very much still play out in very similar races and within races. And I feel like that's at the core, that there's an issue of profiling, but also maybe a slight issue of not completely accepting yourself in that racial space that you are. And that's why there's still this us and them mentality that might allow somebody to prejudge a situation and act on it without actually finding out what's happening.
You were right about that guardedness, because internalized racism is very much the thing. I think that's what you were speaking to, internalized racism. And I think that's what Martin Luther King Jr. was speaking to, even Malcolm X. And these are things that we still find today in things that are very straightforward, like series like Dear White People, that talked about internalized racism too, in certain sense, or evoked it. Like it was subtle, but it was there. It's because like this series is talking about the truth of like there's still like inside a race, there is still sometimes a need for people to, or an insanity to try to classify people by a light complexion or dark complexion, or think about people and judge them for their skin color or culture or background. And you see how pregnant it is about like socialization, because sometimes you don't even want to think these things, but you see someone in the streets and it's a burly black man, and you say like, whoa, like, is he going to attack me or steal my things? And I think it's very hurtful, but I think it's a reality for a lot of people. And I know, like, even in my family and my culture, it's a reality. So I wouldn't be surprised that it's a reality in the United States. And that it was the core of such a violent act, because actually we see less physically violent acts of that, but still in terms of like energy or repetition of this pattern through a lot of people, through a lot of our culture, a lot of our art, and a lot of our interactions within races. So that makes sense to me.
Go ahead, Nadia.
Yeah, I just feel like it was a senseless act, and it was definitely, it had to have been a mental issue, you know, to go from 0 to 100 and think that it was necessary to kill someone. Even in that fear, you could have just called the police or something. Yeah, that's pretty much what I had to say.
I feel like this might be a good place to pivot to the UK, because they're also colonial, or they were colonial power. There's been a lot of changes with Brexit, and the kind of experiencing the same patterns as maybe what we were seeing in China with, you know, the whole denial of maybe all the things that led up to Brexit, and then the fact that it may have not been the best decision. And then I feel like there's also some historical significance, because the prime minister, his background, I believe, is Indian, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, or Southeast Asian. Yeah, so I don't know, I want to open it up for that and see if there was sort of how the energy feels with that compared to what we've been talking about, like in the States or in China.
Well, Brexit was made on, the choice of Brexit was made on this feeling of like Europe is taking from us, we're better out with ourselves, or we're better out with like Anglo-Saxon countries, meaning we're better out trading with the United States, which didn't work, by the way. And yeah, we're just like, we need our glory back. So it was not like some type of far-right election, but it might be compared to a few of the things that Europe has been through in terms of elections. The only thing is that it was really like 7-year process of trying to get out, and then it didn't work. And they did try to go with it and take it to the max with like the party and the several ministers that were there. They just like went with it and really respected the choice to go with Brexit. But in the end, like it still didn't work. And I feel the choice of a new minister also went with, and also like the global demonstrations and kind of like slowing down of the country and shutdowns in many parts of the country. Plus, the new minister just reflected that actually the people were like, hey, like, we want to go back to this other choice or make a new choice. And right now the media inside the country is trying to say like, oh, Brexit is not that bad. See, the UK and Europe have finally come to terms on a few things, so things might look up, but people are still like, no. We want something different. And yeah, I think there's a lot to say about it. We might want to expand on that in a different conversation. But yeah, in terms of past, like obviously, like the death of the Queen has also brought up the fact that the people in the UK have a tendency to say the fault was somewhere else or to other people instead of themselves. So there's definitely something about like really looking inside and seeing like, okay, what went wrong there? Like the fault is not always like in other people and in other countries and in somewhere else and in our neighbor. The fault is sometimes in you too, because that wouldn't have happened if the people didn't make this choice also inside.
Yeah, I feel like when I feel into the choice of Brexit and what happened with Britain there, I feel like there was the arguments about it, like the macroeconomic arguments of it. But then there's also just this feeling of like just a sentiment that Britain wanted to separate itself in terms of like as a whole, like there's more energy behind that sentiment, barely, that Britain wanted to separate itself, and that it felt like it's like, oh, like our culture and who we are is threatened, and we want to pull away from that. And like Yureen, like you're saying, Yureen, like that Britain was like, let's pivot toward other like Anglo-Saxon countries like the US and trade with them. And I feel like it was more of that like tribal mentality, like Granville has said about different topics, like it's more like tribalism. And I felt like you can't make like a big economic decision based on that. And you have to be honest about what you're making your decisions based off of, because you can dress it up in these like macroeconomic arguments, but it doesn't change the fact that maybe this decision is fueled by like that kind of that illusion of our culture is threatened, or we are, let's be tribalistic. Is that a word? There you go.
Yeah, so something that stands out about it is, if you look into their past and their history and just the history of that country as a whole, it's been characterized by quite a bit of conflict. It's been characterized by quite a bit of conquering of other countries. And I just feel like being part of the EU kind of almost deposed Britain from its perceived superiority. Mm-hmm. And so it had to exit something that threatened its ill-conceived perception of power. And having done so, there's further threats to its sovereignty. And what do you do under threat? You consolidate, you find allies. Enter stage right, the EU. Just saying.
Funny, because this choice to save the country probably accelerated Northern Ireland's desire for independence. Just saying, but probably is going to be interesting to observe.
Yep, interesting to observe. But on that note, thank you everybody for the conversation. We have reached our hour. Thank you to everybody that's followed us. Please feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel, where you'll find all our previous conversations and any other live discussions that have taken place in our Unionism Spiritual Discussion Group on Facebook. And we look forward to seeing all of you next week. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.